I'm Chuck Olenek. I'm a Ukrainian American, and since the war began between Russia and Ukraine, actually that makes it sound like it was mutual. Since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, I've had friends asking me what I know about it, what I think about it, because I'm a Ukrainian, they happen to know. And when they ask me questions about it, I have to end up stepping back into my role of history teacher to just kind of explain what's happening. And unfortunately, the way I tend to do it is I tend to make comparisons and look at patterns, because that's kind of what you do with history. And I thought I'd speak out about Crimea. Yeah, 8 years ago, March 18th, 2014, Crimea was annexed by Vladimir Putin's Russia. And he'd been lining troops up and bringing them in since February. But then in March, a referendum was held with people voting under the barrels of guns that Russian soldiers were holding. And Crimea ended up becoming the Republic of Crimea. And it was essentially annexed by Russia. Annexed sounds a lot more polite than stolen. And the Russian ruble became official currency alongside the Ukrainian hryvnia. And some might consider this the Slavic version of the Anschluss that united Austria and Germany to form a greater Germany. This is like right before World War II. And to better understand the comparison, I've got to tell some backstory to make the Anschluss comparison more understandable. So we have to go back actually to the end of World War I, or the Great War, before we started numbering world wars, or to the war to end all wars, when we believed that actually would happen. Of the 7 treaties which ended the Great War, one of them forbade Austria's political or economic union with the German Reich without the agreement of the Council of the League of Nations. No, not the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that was signed March 3rd, 1918. That one, the new Bolshevik government of Russia and the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire signed off, and that pulled Russia out of World War I, gave land away to the Central Powers, and it recognized the independence of Ukraine. No, not the Treaty of Versailles, signed 15 months later on June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. That one was aimed at Germany having to assume the blame for the war. No, it was the lesser-known Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, signed 72 days later, dismantling the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Hitler rebuilt Germany following the Great War, and he pretty much thumbed his nose at the Treaty of Versailles and the near-impotent League of Nations, and he dreamed of convincing all Volksdeutsch, those were like ethnic Germans who were living outside of Nazi Germany, as in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Western districts in Poland, they should strive to bring these regions home into Greater Germany. Does this sound familiar or what? Now, Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg announced there was going to be a referendum, and it was to decide whether Austria was going to possibly unify with Germany in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, or actually the other treaty, or would Austria retain its sovereignty? And this was going to be a referendum that was going to be held March 13th, 1938, because there was pressure from pro-unification activists. Adolf Hitler had other ideas. Okay, I mentioned the H word, and We all know the rule, especially in Facebook debates, of once you mention Hitler, the argument is, considered over. But I have to try to make the comparison, because what history is about is you look for patterns. And not because history repeats itself, but like Mark Twain said, and there's a couple of different variations I'd heard, history doesn't repeat, but it echoes, or history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. I like either version. And one of the things you have to be very wary of with history is when you are looking for a pattern, you might inadvertently start taking pieces of information that only support your argument. So you start to trick yourself. So you have to look at evidence that's laid out in front of you and try to be as dispassionate as possible when fitting the pieces together. So anyway, portraying this as defying the popular will of the people of Germany and Austria, Hitler threatened an invasion to basically seal the deal. And a day before the planned referendum, he ended up convincing Schuschnigg to resign. And German troops marched over the border into Austria, unopposed by the Austrian military, and they were greeted with wild enthusiasm. And a plebiscite was held April 10th, and it made the Anschluss an official thing, with hardly a shot being fired. And you've seen plenty of pictures of the Jewish citizens of Vienna being put to work scrubbing the sidewalks clean of anti-German graffiti. Okay. This is very different, in my opinion, than the case of Crimea and Ukraine. You could say ethnic Russians were voting for their independence, and much of the world viewed the referendum held in Crimea as a sham because, please keep in mind, the way the referendum was conducted was under the barrels of guns that were being held by Russian soldiers pointed at the people voting. And the soldiers were there because they were supposedly keeping ethnic Russians safe from the Ukrainians. Okay, maybe it could be a little like the Anschluss, except that the Ukrainian units that were there were woefully unprepared for a Russian assault, and they either fled or they surrendered, or in some cases they defected. And by March 21st of 2014, just 3 days after the referendum, the Republic of Crimea became a federal subject of Russia, but it wasn't unopposed. It didn't happen quietly. I prefer to think of Crimea as being more like the Sudetenland, those sections of northern and western Bohemia and northern Moravia near the Sudeten mountain ranges, which had a predominantly German population and which Hitler wanted as the last territorial demand I have to make in Europe. Hitler met with French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier and more famously remembered British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to agree to what was going to happen to Sudetenland. No Czechoslovak representative was invited to these discussions. Germany was now able to walk into Sudetenland without firing a shot, and the famous peace in our time was announced. And then the world was at war before Czechoslovakia could ready itself. And we watched for 2 years. Yeah, to me, it's a lot more like the Sudetenland. The Ukrainians weren't invited to participate either. And the world breathed easier because it's only a small piece of land and it's happening over there and it's not really our problem. They may have gasped in horror or shrugged, but Ukraine realized it was at war in a fight for its very survival. In April, so 1 month later, in April of 2014, demonstrations by pro-Russian groups in the Donbas region of Ukraine escalated into war between the Ukrainian military and Russian-backed separatists of the self-declared republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. Those were along the Russian border. And this was to put political pressure on Ukraine, on Kyiv by Moscow. Very specifically, if you move closer to the West, if you even think about joining NATO or the European Union, you're going to be punished for it. And this was a serious miscalculation by Putin and the Kremlin, even if the West was dragging its feet. In July of 2014, either Russians or pro-Russian forces shot down a Malaysian airliner over the eastern Ukraine conflict zone, and all 298 passengers were killed. My gut actually says that it happened to be Russian forces because there was some pretty sophisticated weaponry that was used to bring down the airliner. But I remember talking with one of my more conservative friends who said, well, you can't really, it's not a big enough thing to go to war over. I guess this was kind of like comparing the airliner to sinking the Lusitania. That's not big enough to go to war over. And, well, you can't really prove it was Russian military that did this, even though it was pretty much Russian military hardware. You can't even prove that it was pro-Russian separatists. It could have even been Ukrainians who shot down this airliner hoping to draw the West into a larger war. Well, that sure sounds a lot like Putin. Now, NATO verified in August of 2014 that unmarked Russian military vehicles had crossed the border into the Donetsk Republic, and there was an undeclared war that had begun between Ukrainian forces on one side and separatists intermingled with Russian troops on the other side, although Russia attempted to hide that involvement. And the war basically became a static thing. There were repeated attempts at a ceasefire which failed. In 2015, the Minsk II agreements were signed by Russia and Ukraine, but disputes pretty much kept them from being implemented. By 2019, 7% of Ukraine was classified by Kyiv as temporarily occupied territories, while the Russian government had indirectly acknowledged the presence of Russian troops in Ukraine. So here we are, 8 years later. We're watching maternity hospitals being bombed, civilian housing being bombed, besieged towns being denied food or water, people in those besieged towns not being given an opportunity to leave as the bombing continues. We're watching public officials being kidnapped and puppets being installed to, further the Russian propaganda. We're seeing thousands of Ukrainian citizens being deported by the Russians over the border into Russian camps. And in the meantime, we've got a tyrant that some people would still defend, blaming the victims for his war crimes. And he speaks of purifying his country. Well, that's a page right out of Hitler's playbook. There's a pattern from history. Or how about ridding his land of wreckers and traitors? Well, that's one of Stalin's speeches. And he's arresting his own people who protest or disagree. Well, that's from both Hitler and Stalin. And he's holding a victory parade with patriotic songs, including a performance of a song made in the USSR with the opening lyrics, Ukraine and Crimea, Belarus and Moldova, it's all my country. Personally, I like the Beatles song. The thing is, people can't just sit by and idly watch. Fortunately, These war crimes are being documented. They're being put up every day, every few minutes on social media. There are times I have to step away because I'm getting overwhelmed, but I always come back because I think people need information. They need to talk about this stuff. They need to make it understandable and realize how wrong this is, and that simply allowing it to continue, you may as well have joined up with Putin. I hope you stick with me as I try to wrap my own brain around this stuff. Slava Ukraini.